So if you're like me, you've probably used GitHub for a while for a lot of your self-hosted repositories and stuff like that. And for me, that's perfectly fine for something I want to share publicly. But as I add more and more Git repositories for my private data, such as my website, Ansible repositories, infrastructure as code, things like that, I want to start self-hosting some of those more private Git repositories. And I suspect if you're a larger home lab or an organization, you probably want to do the same. So in this video, I'm going to set up Gitea, Git with a cup of tea. Gitea is essentially a self-hosted Git repository with issue manager and things like that, similar to what you find with GitHub or GitLab. You can host it yourself. It's pretty small and easy to do. So I'm going to host it in Proxmox and IaaC container. Of course, all of these instructions also apply to any Debian 12 system. So yeah, feel free to come along on this adventure. So I'm going to put Gitea on an IaaC container. It's nice and simple. It's a pretty simple app. It just needs a bunch of space for all the Git repositories. So I'm going to create an IaaC container with a secondary mount point to store the Git repositories. So here we're going to create CT. It can be unprivileged, that's fine. So I'm going to use Debian 12. That's a pretty good base. We're going to give you local ZFS 8 gigs. That's our root. Then I'm going to add a second mount point here. And I don't know, we'll start with 64 gig. We can always add it later. And we're going to put this at var lib Gitea. So this is the working directory that all of the data is going to be in, including our Git repository, the database, things like that. And you can check if you want to back that up or not. You probably want to back it up. So now the container is created, we're going to log in and install it. I have the commands on my website, so we're going to run through them and copy and paste them. So first things first, we need Git, because obviously that's pretty important for a Git server. We also need to download the latest version of Gitea. So if we go to their download site, dl.gitea.com, so currently the latest version is 1.20.2, so I just clicked here, and the version I want is Linux AMD 64. Unless you're on ARM, then you might want one of these other ARM ones. But you'll probably know that if you're on ARM. So Linux AMD 64, it's a big file. It's actually the binary itself, so it's just the binary, it's all there is to it. That's the latest version, so we're going to put it in user local bin and make it executable. And we're just going to name it Gitea, so we're going to strip off the rest of the name on the end. So then we check if it works by asking for its version. We're going to create a user, a system user for Gitea. So that's the username. It's also going to get a group of the same name, and its home directory is /Gitea. So then we're going to create the directories in var lib that Gitea needs, and own them to Gitea, permissions to Gitea, and give it some permissions in its home directory /Gitea. So let's go ahead and do all of that. Obviously you're going to want to put in the latest version here, but other than that you should be able to just copy and paste. Okay, so here it says Gitea version, so that's the version statement, that's the add new user, and then the rest of it doesn't have a output. So we're going to make a service for it. So this is the service unit that I wrote. It's based on the one that they have in their example, but shortened a bit. So we're going to run as the user and group Gitea. Our working directory is var lib Gitea, and we also get a directory in run. So eventually it's going to create this file app.ini, but we're going to let it use the wizard to do that, so we're not going to do that right away. All the directories are set up. I've given it capability to bind to low numbered ports, so we can use port 80 and 443. So let's copy this in. So this is where the file is going to go. Just nano that. Copy the unit and save that, and then daemon reload and enable now. So enable now means enable and start. So before I do that, I'm going to get my IP address. So that is my IP address, because I'm going to need this in just a second. So when we start Gitea, it's initially going to hang, and it's going to wait for us to run through the first setup wizard, and it's going to kind of get stuck and the command line of the enable now, which is kind of weird, but you'll see what I mean in just a sec. So I'm going to copy this command and paste it, remembering that my IP address is up here. So now it's stuck, so I'm going to copy the IP address, and I'm going to go there. So I went to port 3000 at my IP address. So we're going to set up Gitea. So because this is just like a home lab setup, I'm not using MySQL or Postgres. But if you're doing this for like a business or a bigger organization, you'd want to use a better database than SQLite. But I'm going to use SQLite. So database is going to be in our data directory, varlib Gitea. Gitea get with a cup of tea. You can name whatever you want, obviously. Repositories will go here. LFS will go there. That's the system username. If you have a domain name, you can put it here. This should be 22. I'm going to set this to 80 initially. I want to enable SSL, which should mean 443, but since I don't have SSL set up yet, I'm going to set it to 80 so it doesn't try to do insecure connections on the secure port. And then we'll set this again. It's going to be teapot. And it's not going to get a port because it's the usual port. And logs. We also have optional settings if you'd like. So we can enable that. If you want to be able to send email, you can set up an SMTP server to forward through. So in general, by default, it'll allow self-registration, which means that users can create their account in Gitea and have an account. And you probably don't want to just let anyone create an account in your system. So normally the way you would handle this is by deferring authentication to some other service, whether that's LDAP, which could be LDAP or Active Directory or something like that, or to do proxy authentication if you're doing mutual TLS or you're letting the authentication proxy deal with users. In that case, what you want to do is let users self-create an account, but restrict them to log in through a different user system. So the first time they log in, they'll be treated as a new user in Gitea. They'll have to create an account in Gitea, but the passwords and stuff are handled by the external auth system. If you want to have accounts directly in Gitea, then you want to disable self-registration. So I'm going to disable that. So allow registration through external services. That would mean that when you authenticate successfully, if you don't already have an account, it helps you create one. So these are general settings you'll probably want to look at. So you could create an administrative user here, or you can just let the first registered user become an admin. So I'm going to create an end user. There we go. So install Gitea. Now we're going to let it sit for a little bit. So now because we're accessing it from port 3000, we have to switch back to port 80. And there we go. So I'm logged in as Appelard. It's kind of cool. I have no repositories, but I can create them. So before you go putting this on the internet, you probably want to enable TLS. So 3 different ways to do this. The first way is to use a reverse proxy. This approach is what you should use if you want to use an authenticating proxy. So you could use something like Caddy that supports mutual TLS. If you're using another front-end proxy that's designed to do authentication, that'd be a good approach. Second approach is to use Let's Encrypt, or if you have your own certificate authority, you could use that. So then the server will get certs using the IaaC protocol. Third option is to use a self-signed cert. But whatever you do, you should use one of them, because you want to keep your site secure with TLS. You don't just want to have it wide open for HTTP. So I'm going to show you how to do the second and third option. So ACME with Let's Encrypt, or self-signed certificates. So over here, I'm going to stop the service so I can edit the file. So this is the config file that it generated when it ran the setup wizard. And so down here in the server section, we have some things we can change. So here is a diff of what we need to use self-signed certificates. So we need to set protocol to HTTPS, so it defaults to HTTP. So redirect other port means it's going to bind on port 80 and redirect to 443. And these are the paths of the cert file and the key file. And down here, we're going to change port 80 to 443. So I set it up as 80 earlier so we didn't have insecure connections on 443, which would make the web browser suspicious. So that's essentially what we got to do here. We got to add these lines, and we have to change that. So there is also an option to say what port you redirect from, but it defaults to 80, which is what we want anyway. So we'll save that. Now before we can start the server, we have to generate the self-signed certificate. So they have a command that does that, Gitea cert. So you need to give it the host name to generate for your certificate. And by default, it'll be owned by root because you ran the command as root. So we have to give it read permissions on these files, so 640, and then restart the service. So I'll do all of that. You would obviously need to change your host name here. There we go. One thing I forgot to mention, whatever name you put in as the domain name, it's actually going to redirect to. So if DNS isn't working at this point, you're going to want to get that sorted out first. There we go. There we go. Now we can sign in. There we go. Set up. So if you're using Git with a self-signed certificate, you'll have to use this option here. SSL verify is false, or Git will freak out because the certificate's not valid. So with this one, we set slightly different options. So we still set protocol as HTTPS and redirect to other port as true. But now we say enable Acme, and we have to accept the terms of service of Acme. And at a minimum, we need the Acme directory and the Acme email. If you don't put Acme URL, it'll default to Let's Encrypt. So I've put here the staging directory, so you can mess with it all you want. If you leave this out, it'll use the production Let's Encrypt directory. And if you have your own cert authority, you can use that instead. And then you just restart after this. You don't have to generate a self-signed cert like you did earlier. One more thing we can't forget is setting up our Git client to use an HTTP username and password with our server. Otherwise, if we try to git clone, it'll fail and it'll say the repository doesn't exist. Let's come over here to Visual Studio Code and see how I set that up. So over here in VS Code, I'm going to go terminal, and I'm going to run git bash. If you're not on Windows, you would probably already be running bash or a compatible shell, so you can just skip that. So we're going to git config global credential dot, and then the URL. So I said git config global, so it's part of our global config and not our local per repository config, and then credential dot the URL dot username, and then applard, which is the username itself. So that should work now. So I'm going to say clone git repository, and I'm going to say so I'm going to type in my URL. You could get this from Gitea. In my case, it's similar to GitHub. It's your username / repository name. There we go. So now if I want to do something that requires authentication, go over here to source control, and so I do push. So over here it popped up asking for my credentials. So it already knows Applard, and I'll give it my password. There we go. So at this point we got a working Gitea server. Git works, the UI works, I can create my repos and go on from there. I have some upcoming tutorials planned, especially around Ansible Semaphore, which is a really nice web UI for Ansible that I'm going to hope to use to do infrastructure as code projects. And so I need to Git repository for that, and that's what led me to setting up Gitea. So here we are. If you want to see that project, don't forget to like and subscribe. Follow along for all the future adventures, Ansible, all the kind of good stuff. I have a Discord server link down below if you want to chat with me. I also have a Ko-fi if you'd like to tip me there. More than welcome to. It's not a recurring thing or anything like that. It's just a one-time. And I have a website too. All the commands for this are on the blog post link in the description below. And as always, I will see you on the next adventure.